Oh, there we go. The camera's working. Welcome in everybody in the chat. Welcome, of course, our guest of honor for the third episode of Tofu Tech Talk. We have Homozygoat here, or Marcus, whatever way we want to refer. I'll try to remember one of those usernames. Welcome in to Tofu Tech Talk. Please feel free to introduce yourselves as loosely or as much as you wish.
Sounds good. Thank you for the polite introduction. As Tofu said, hi, I'm Homozygoat. My government name is Marcus, so you can use whichever one makes you happy. I'm a fifth year PhD candidate here in the land of Bernie Sanders and maple syrup, aka the state of Vermont, out here in the east coast of the US. I do a variety of things. At least as far as my dissertation work is concerned, I'm an epilepsy researcher, so I'm a neuroscientist these days. Those are the pants that I wear in academia. But outside of campus, outside of my actual dissertation work, I kind of fell back on my bachelor's and master's in microbiology, and I started a Twitch stream a couple of years ago when the COVID pandemic first began. So I often wear my infectious disease pants when streaming on Twitch, talking about all of the different relevant bits of science there. But since then, everything that I've been doing has kind of grown into a broader science communication effort to, combat misinformation and to try and ultimately sort of get people to think more like a scientist, right? To think more in line with material reality as, people like you and I see it and understand it. There's a pretty big like chasm in terms of the disconnect between what people do and what science says people should do. So that's kind of been my role for the past couple of years on this platform, is to try and combat all of that. And surprisingly, it's been a lot more successful than I thought. So I think
Yes.
there's a really good opportunity on Twitch for people like us to engage in science communication.
Absolutely, you did phenomenal. To people who don't, because of course, my community, for example, might be so interlinked with yours. Homozygote here actually just quite recently got Twitch partner, so congratulations. That is
Thank you.
personally a goal I wish someday to get, of course. But honestly, congratulations. That is amazing. First try as well. I think you might be my first person I know who got Twitch partner on the first attempt. So well done to that, honestly. Before we go
Thank you.
into like the huge science part of the I have a personal question as to your username, your handle, Homozygote. If you do you have a story behind it, or
Yeah,
so I
there's
know.
a bit of a story. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, go on. No, because I know what the word with the e at the end is, but I don't like. Is there a story behind the rest of it?
Yeah, so when I first started streaming, this was not my username at all. This was more or less me, just like I had just gotten a webcam, right when COVID was beginning to do everything
Mm,
remotely in academia. So I was like, trying to just kind of get my training wheels on and test out streaming in the first place. So this was definitely not my name before, but a community member in a different community that I was in as a viewer, as a chatter, recommended I change my name, and he basically told me like nobody's ever going to watch you if you have a name like this, because it was an old like computer generated name that I've been just using for years to chat.
mm,
So I was like, you know what? You kind of have a point. My old username was not catchy. It was just some letters and numbers. I almost
mm.
probably came off as a bot. So I took a little bit of deliberation, but we came up with homozygote for a couple of reasons. One, because of the science pun. Right? People understand the word ending in GOTE, so that's genetics. So changing it to the animal goat, that kind of gave an opportunity for branding and to sort of make the old science pun where you can explain the concept of homozygosity or heterozygosity using goats that are filled in with different shades of colors. So the actual science part of that worked out really well because obviously my stream content is very heavily science focused. So the name, it took maybe like a week or two of thinking about it, but like
Mm.
once that came into my head, it was like, all right, I know this is it. We're going for that.
I thought
It's
Goat
also
was
it's also
greatest of all time.
oh, I mean that's that. This is the thing. Like this username, the longer you
Very
think about it,
good.
the more entendres
Mm,
that are there. So like
mm.
greatest of all time also shows up. I think a couple of people referred to me as goat. So like greatest of all time goat. Um, and then the actual homo in front of it, since I'm a gay person, like that is even better to kind of lead with that. which has actually led to a couple of comedic moments and some other more, I guess, debate-heavy Twitch panels where
Mm.
people didn't really think about it. And it's like, well, it's the first syllable of my username. I can't really telegraph it any harder
There's
than
so
I
many
am now.
layers. Mm.
So it's just layer after layer, and it's always really interesting when people like sit down and then
Ask.
like they think about it. I see the wheels turning, and I'm like, okay, yeah, you get it, you get it. Like there's many entendres to this name.
You need to what's that word? Not put a patent on it, but what's it called when you make
Trademark it.
yeah, trademark it. There we go. Very
Yeah,
important.
maybe
Top
I
tier
might
name.
need to.
Mm. All right. Well, I guess this is a perfect time to kind of slide into it. So you said you have a microbiology background, and now you're doing a PhD in epilepsy. You're about how many 3 years now in, or how long is your PhD?
This is year 5, so I think like July would like be maybe the start of what's technically the
So you're
6th year, but
you're approaching the
um
end now. Then
I'm approaching the end. Yeah, the expectation is that I graduate by August. So I'm looking at a summer graduation date. So fingers crossed, fingers crossed. The
yes.
data and the research align with that. I'm exiting a big troubleshooting period now. I'm hoping once all that's done, then a lot of what's ahead of me, I think, is very laid out. It's
Mm.
crystalline, and I just need some time for biology to do its thing. That's always the downside of biology is you just have to wait for mice to reproduce or for things to happen. So just a lot of hurry up and wait, basically.
I don't know. My community are known as lab rats. That's the pet name I have for my community. So
Love it.
just be careful about sacrificing mice or any rats here, because it's a sensitive topic on my stream.
Hey,
but
I mean, look, I empathize with the chat. I wish there were alternatives. I will absolutely take chat side on this. I genuinely wish there were other ways to do this, but
better ethical
uh,
options. Mm.
yeah, it's either, at least for my research, it's mice or it's people. So one of those is very much a lesser evil, but I do recognize it's still technically an evil.
Well, it is something, unfortunately, that has to be done for the greater good, or so they say. But regardless, so you're almost finished your research, and we did discuss briefly in DMs that you might not be able to express completely what your research is about, because it's understandable that there's a lot of privacy laws coming in place, and if you haven't published your work just yet as well, there's little things like that. So if you could even just introduce epilepsy to people who don't have a background in this, like to someone like me, again, I'm a physicist, I have no clue. So I'd be really happy, ears open, from a general audience perspective, to explain what epilepsy is about and a little bit about your research.
Totally. I think I can actually, talk about this to a decent extent.
Okay.
Intimate, specific details for specific proteins and pathways and stuff. That's kind of the bits that I'll leave out, since we're coming up on like getting everything together to
Mm.
publish. But the timing on this is good because I just presented everything at a conference yesterday in a talk.
Well
So
done.
I'm already in this headspace. So
Nice.
I
You've got
really like how
momentum.
we timed all of this. Um, so people don't really know about epilepsy that much. It's one of those things that people don't really have even like a concept of until it happens to either them or a loved one or someone they care
Mm.
about. It's uncharacteristically brutal. It's something that really causes significant declines in quality of life. Depending on the country, like in the U.S., for example, if you have epilepsy, like oftentimes you're not allowed to drive a car because there's a risk that you could have a seizure while driving and cause a traffic accident.
Mm.
So it really has big implications for somebody's life. About 1% of the population, both here in the US and globally, actually have epilepsy. So it affects a lot more people than you know. And it's something that's kind of, quote unquote, invisible, right? You don't really see it. Nobody's wearing a shirt that says, be nice to me, I have epilepsy. It's not really a thing. So it's something that when people actually choose to reveal that information, you kind of understand, at least from my perspective as a researcher, like, yeah, this has really had a pretty drastic impact on your life. So like I resonate more with people who have epilepsy because of this work. What's difficult about epilepsy is a lot of the treatments out there are just like treating symptoms, right? They're
Mm.
dedicated to trying to just prevent seizures, and to sort of deal with the consequences of seizures, but they often don't address like the actual root cause of why seizures are
Yes.
happening in the first place. And when you try to figure out, like, okay, what are the reasons why seizures happen in the first place? The list of why is like a mile long, right? It could be secondary to an infection. It could be because somebody took the wrong combination of medications on accident. Like there are a wide variety of reasons, but what the actual sort of academic research tends to focus on are genetic causes, right? We're focusing more on either inherited mutations or a variety of issues in brain development over the course of someone's life that could manifest this. So that's more or less what I work on, is trying to understand mutations, right? I'm working on genetics. So my project was more or less just this like thing scribbled on the back of a napkin by my advisor. He and some of his collaborators at another university, I think NYU in particular, they found some very interesting genetic changes and epigenetic changes in the brains of people who actually just died unexpectedly from epilepsy, because that's a thing that can happen too. You can have seizures so profound that you just die from it, and at any age too. I mean, this is something
Wow.
that sometimes happens in children, but it can happen in young adults, middle-aged adults, and even the elderly. So um, those people were generous enough to donate their bodies to science, and in the course
Yeah.
of their treatment, we were able to sort of obtain data from the biopsies of the parts of their brain that were showing seizure activity, and there were some very interesting genetic changes. Specifically, I can't reveal which ones those were, but that's kind of my work, is to start from like, okay, here's what's going on, trying to recreate that in a laboratory setting, and then setting up a system to try and figure out, okay, how does this even cause epilepsy in the first place. So a lot of my work is dedicated towards using brain cells harvested from mice that were actually harvested, I want to say, maybe a couple of days before they're born. So we're actually going for developing a mouse embryo, essentially, to
Oh.
look at their brain and recreate these changes to see what's happening on like the individual brain cell level, in sort of like a petri dish, so to speak, to figure out, okay, like what does the genetic change that we're studying actually do? Like, does it
Mm.
make them fire in a way that makes them more seizure like? Does it cause them to mature differently? Do they sort of connect with each other in a way that lends itself towards having a seizure? So there are a lot of things both on the molecular level, and then sort of like zooming out in terms of groups of brain cells all kind of connected together,
Mm.
firing together, or firing all at once, which is the definition of a seizure in the first place. There's a lot of interesting, academically speaking, work to actually figure these things out, and to ultimately make that gap of knowledge a lot smaller, to figure out, okay, how do these changes lead to epilepsy in the first place. The grander hope in all of that is to try and see if, for people who have these specific mutations, if we can use drugs to treat it. And the specific mutations in question for other diseases, specifically cancer, already actually have drugs that are approved to treat it. And there are other drugs in the clinical trial pipeline that can enter the brain much better than the other drugs approved historically. That could also be used to treat this. So, in theory, this would kind of be a bit of a paradigm shift to actually identify a root genetic cause and then use a drug that's either approved or about to be approved to treat something that is not even cancer, right? To actually treat epilepsy. And hopefully, that would improve somebody's quality of life.
Okay, wow. Thank you so much for that really in-depth explanation of how your research goes. I'd like to jump in. I don't know, again, you can bluntly tell me that you're not allowed to answer this. So I'll probe
Sure, go
you
ahead.
as much as I can until I'm not allowed. That sounded weird. But my point was, so you're harvesting mice brains to do your research in epilepsy, right? And
Hmm.
you say that you harvest them before they're basically born.
Yep.
And how so again, I'm a very simple-minded person. You are researching epilepsy. You want to be able to study what in the brain triggers these epileptic seizures, from what I understand, right? A very simple question. How do you use a mouse's brain when it's not epileptic, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, I that question makes perfect sense.
Okay.
So what we do essentially is like, I think that the specific developmental stage for any mouse biology understanders that might be listening, we harvest at like E17. So this is essentially like a couple of days before the mouse pups are actually born.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we essentially we take their brains, we digest all the connective tissue, and we manage to create sort of like a suspension of like single brain cells that are just floating in cell culture
Ooh.
liquid, and then we're able to put them on specialized culture dishes, so that way we can
Wow.
actually see like individual brain cells when we like look at them under a basic laboratory microscope.
Like it's just
Um,
electron microscope.
not even an electron, just a generic like
Oh,
benchtop phase contrast
cool.
microscope. Like you can I can show you a couple of like immunofluorescence pictures.
Yeah,
As long
if
as
you
you don't
could
know the
send,
details, I can send you some photos.
as in it's okay to share on Twitch or
Yeah.
just in
Oh
private.
yeah, totally. I
Okay,
mean,
okay, perfect.
you can show people. It might take me a second because I have like a
No
million
worries.
folders.
No worries.
Um,
If you don't want to rush it now, you can take your time about it. I
yeah,
can
I'll,
share
I'll
it in my
more I
Discord
guess.
afterwards, even if
Yeah, I'll focus on answering your question first while I
mm,
kind of click through all of this.
multitask.
But like to answer the back end of your question of like
Mm,
how do you actually take brain cells that are at face value normal and try to make them epileptic? So what
mm,
what we what we do is we have and this is a very common tool in like biology research, not
okay.
just in neuroscience, but in general. We have what are called lentiviruses. These are actual like recombinant laboratory derived virus. These have been in use for like decades. Essentially, a lentivirus is, for the context of what scientists use it for, it's HIV with all the harmful bits stripped out,
Oh
and
yes.
it's genetically engineered so that it inactivates itself once you've actually gotten it to infect a cell once. So through a whole separate process, you create these viruses that have all the machinery and the bits from HIV that will take whatever gene of interest you're trying to study and permanently put it into the genetic code of whatever cell you're trying to work with. So
Mm-hmm.
once we have all of these mouse brains sort of in a petri dish, we usually give them about a day just to sort of adjust to being in a cell culture incubator. And then the next day, I take a bunch of these viruses with the genes of interest that I'm trying to study, and actually infect the brain cells. That way, now these changes that they don't normally have are sort of forced upon them. Right? They don't really have a choice.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how we alter or transform them to be more representative of what was happening in that human brain, to recreate that change. That's the sort of the tool that we use to create it in the first place. It's laboratory recombinant HIV, but
That's
this
so
is a tool that's been
exciting.
in use for a very long time. So it's not quite groundbreaking, but
Mm,
when people hear that, do they kind of think of one of two things? They think of like, oh my God, that's a safety issue. Like, are you going to give yourself HIV? And as
mm,
long as I don't drink it, I should be okay. Drink it or pipette it onto myself, which of course I'm not going to do.
mm.
But the other thing that people kind of think about is like, wait, you make viruses in a laboratory? Are you leaking viruses? Are you going to start a pandemic? People kind of jokingly say that to me sometimes. So
Yeah.
it's like, okay, yeah, I I see your joke. I see where you're coming from. Nice. Very few people actually take that seriously, where they think I'm actually going to like release a virus onto people, and then I have to be like, okay, no, you've been victimized by a conspiracy theory. That's not how science works. So your question is a really good one because a lot of people actually like are curious about that point, but
Mm,
then their curiosity almost takes them into like a conspiracy theory wormhole where they start believing science works in ways that it very much does not work in.
mm. I see that. Thank you so much for answering that. I got excited because, again, I'm no biologist, so but my understanding came from Grey's Anatomy. Grey's Anatomy taught me about that HIV thing in one episode, so that's really cool actually. It's a delivery system, right? From what I understand as well, that it can be used like a
Yep.
bit like a post office. Um,
Exactly. You're delivering genetic information that you want to introduce into the cells, and with lentiviruses, it's a permanent thing. There are other virus-based delivery systems where it's not quite as permanent. It's a
mhm,
bit more transient, but a lot of researchers, just to create like a model in the first place, they use the permanent way. Um, One of the other approaches that my work kind of uses is in parallel with that virus system, we kind
yeah.
of engage the cell's native machinery to recreate the change instead of just brute forcing it by introducing it from the outside. We sort of address things endogenously to activate specific genes and specific features in a more sort of natural way that would be more representative of what would happen inside of an actual brain, rather than sort of just the laboratory like, all right, we're creating a system, we're gonna brute force this, we're gonna make this happen, and see what happens. And interestingly, all of my results kind of agree. So that's what's really
Oh,
nice
when the
is
graph fits, when the
consistency.
plot fits. Oh, it's so good.
Yep. Yeah,
um,
very, very thankful that it worked out in a way that we wanted it to.
oh, that's fantastic. That honestly, your research sounds so like absolutely broad because you're describing basically neurology to me, microbiology, broad biology as well because there's a few things, then genetics, and I'm pretty sure
Hmm.
viruses comes under another classification in biology. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's a separate virology if you want
Oh
to. Sometimes
Jesus.
that gets lumped into microbiology as an umbrella, since they do they're very small. Viruses are microscopic, so
It's
it fits the bill.
insane. Wow. And I'm guessing it's difficult to do a PhD then like this because you're starting off as a baby first. You're not a baby anymore now. You're 6 years into this. Of course, you're an expert in your field. But when you first started, like all these different fields, do you have multiple they're called supervisors in Ireland, PIs.
Yeah, I have just one PI. There
Just
are
one. Oh wow.
just one. I know we have a collaborator who used to be on campus who
Mm-hmm.
was kind of functioning as that like second advisor role, but he
Yeah.
actually moved his laboratory to a different university, so he left campus like 2 years ago.
Okay.
So I've just had one advisor, and honestly, my current advisor, as nice and awesome as he is, he is quite busy and often overcommitted. So
Yeah.
sometimes I'm just flying solo, kind of doing my own thing for the most part, and I'm more or less telling him these days, like, okay, here's what I'm doing, here's my plan, here are my results. Like, I'm just kind of autonomous at this point,
Yeah.
which to
That's the
some degree is
experience.
kind of the point of grad school. Like, you're
Yep.
supposed to be trained to be your quote unquote independent researcher. But I think I reached that point a lot earlier in my PhD than other people necessarily would have, just because like
Mm.
I got a master's beforehand, so that helped. But I also just really, especially when like COVID hit, I was kind of left to my own devices just by the way things were. It wasn't really anybody's choice or decision. Just other things had to really take priority, and we kind of had to think about how we do research in a
Yeah.
pandemic setting.
It seems that we are actually kind of in parallel because I also did a master's and I also like a year or two into my PhD, 2 years into my PhD, COVID hit, and that was like 2 year. I feel like that's where your PhD research starts to really take off. So the pandemic hitting during that time is really damaging and completely changes the course of your research and stuff like that. And so during the pandemic, you couldn't be in the lab to perform all these experiments in the lab rats. Did you do simulations, computational? Was there any way that you worked around the pandemic?
Oh no, they made us go into the lab. They made us go in. Um, what I will say though is, because this is a lot more popular at the beginning of the pandemic compared to now, but I wore a lot of these. We were masked and distanced for the first, I'd say maybe 6 months, and it was actually a big point of contention with a lot of other graduate student workers on campus and our university, because I was forced. I think this was August of 2020. I was forced to teach like in person. This is the pre-vaccine era, before vaccines even came out. I was forced to teach, ironically, a microbiology lab to 30 undergrads in a room that was not ventilated, with no windows, and we didn't have a mask mandate. We didn't have any masks provided to us by the university, so I actually wound up buying like a half-face respirator with the big P100 filters on it, and I taught with that on. I mean, I taught a whole semester of micro lab wearing a Darth Vader respirator practically, just because I didn't want to take any chances. And everybody else
Yeah.
was kind of given some cloth or some surgical masks, but because I had 2 degrees in microbiology going into this thing, like I kind of applied my knowledge, and I'm like, I kind of need something a little bit more gung ho to actually protect myself. Um, and then in the laboratory setting, I was more able to where I could kind of downgrade from there, because there were less than 30 people in my lab. I think it was maybe at that time 4 or 5 total. So we had some distance to it. So as
That's a
far as my actual
huge lab.
dissertation research, yeah, the space
30
the space was.
researchers in your group.
Oh no, the
Oh, the
30 was,
class.
yeah, that was the class
Oh,
size. The
okay,
actual
okay.
laboratory, no, my actual lab is like, currently it's maybe, I want to say 7 people,
Yeah.
but back then it was, I'd say 5. So we kind of
Yeah.
oscillate around that number depending on who's doing what. Um, but yeah, in terms of doing research in a pandemic setting, we very much had to adjust on the fly to try and distance and figure things out. It's funny because what we were doing at the beginning was very much like appropriate, but people kind of fell off the wagon, and then once vaccines came into the picture, people were very reticent to keep wearing a mask, and then the moment they did that, half the lab got COVID. So I've kept mine on this entire time, and so far I've remained COVID free. But it was a very
Oh
interesting
wow.
moment in like the summer and fall of 2022 when everybody finally felt comfortable enough to take off their masks. My advisor exposed me to it. Another grad student exposed me to it, and another like our lab tech went to Florida and then got it like on their way back. So it was like,
I'm pretty
you know,
sure I went to the States, my one and only time for a conference for what my one to Georgia, and that was the time I got COVID. So thank you,
hmm
America.
yeah. I mean, we're number one in all the worst ways. So I'm glad you have perspective as being outside of America, just how wild and ridiculous we can be.
Oh no, again, I only dipped my foot for a week in the States. I did take a few days
That's
off
all you
extra.
need. That
Oh,
that that's all you need. That's all you need.
uh, oh, thank you so much again for explaining the whole how difficult your research was.
Yeah, of course.
In
I sent you a couple of pictures just for
oh,
later, by the way.
nice. I see if I can. I'm going to click in here and really.
Yeah, you can show them on stream if you feel
Oh,
like it.
they look so pretty. Let me download them so that not that I
Oh.
have any dodgy DMs, but in case anyone. So I have a green one. Let me share screen for my stream. If you could explain what you're allowed to say, of course.
Oh
What
yeah,
is
I
it
mean,
vaguely?
our lentivirus is basically so we can like identify which brain cells we infected in our culture. They have GFP on them, or green fluorescent protein. So
Ah,
um,
so
all
these
of
are.
the brain cells that were infected are green.
Oh my God, that's a lot.
Yeah, we put a fair amount of virus into the cell culture, but that's the point when you're trying to develop a model system. You need to introduce the genetic changes to a lot of cells.
And there's the
The
red one
the
as
the
well.
red, that's actually a stain for a protein called MAP2. This is essentially a tubule, or
Wow.
it's a structural protein essentially in the brain cells, and it stains
Wow.
a lot of the processes. So you can kind of see all the spider web tendril networking that these brain cells engage in after
Mm-hmm.
they've had a couple of weeks to form all these networks in the first place. Um, I could generate the merge just so you see both at the same time, but I gave you those to just kind of as a sampler to show
Yeah.
you like these are what the brain cells actually look like
And this is just a
in a culture setting.
simple microscope you're using to take these images.
Yeah, benchtop microscope with
Wow.
fluorescence capability. Yeah, they've
That's
been edited a
amazing.
little bit in post, but
Just to make them
not
a
not
little bit
very
prettier.
much. Yeah, exactly. Just to get rid of the noise and the granularity.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
of course, of
essentially all we
course.
do.
That is amazing. I think your research sounds absolutely phenomenal. Um, my personal question is like, before we move on, is the ethics question. We kind of touched on it with the rats a little bit and the mice. So
hmm
when I was applying for funding, there was literally a whole section of my funding about ethics, and I had to leave it blank because I'm not creating a black hole in physics. We don't really have an ethics issue usually.
True.
But yeah. So how my question is there a lot of hoops and jumps to go through not figuratively with the rats, but to actually get to allow experimentations on animals?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on like the project idea. For my project specifically, we more or less have to get like institutional approval just to tell them like how we're going to treat the animals and what we're going to do to them, just in terms of
You
getting
feed
the
them
brains
nice
out. So
before. Is that the
yeah, essentially, we be nice to them. We make sure they have all the food and a creature comforts that a mouse could reasonably get in a cage.
mm,
I think broadly speaking, keeping tons of them in cages piled to the ceiling is a little bit inhumane. But again, there's really no alternative, unfortunately. Depending on other projects, though, it can kind of get wild. But we have these institutional committees. They're called IACUCs. It's IACUC. It's an acronym that essentially is comprised of like veterinarians and ethicists who actually sit down and will like look at a researcher's plan to see what they plan on doing with the actual
mm-hmm.
animals, whether it's a mouse, a rat, a pig, insert animal here, depending on what someone's doing. You have to get institutional approval first before you do anything at all. So you have to write up a plan and have it reviewed and approved by
Mm-hmm.
veterinarians and ethicists. So that does take a long time sometimes, especially depending on a given project. There could be drawn out deliberate discussion to figure out what all is appropriate. But I think it's still ultimately a good thing, even though there's kind of a bureaucratic wait time. I think it's worthwhile just to make sure people aren't doing things that they really shouldn't be doing. And yeah, as you said in chat, if you're rich like Elon Musk, you get to circumvent all of that, which is a more structural issue.
Wait, does Elon
Um,
Musk perform experiments on rats and I didn't know?
Wait, I didn't hear what you just said.
Sorry. Does Elon Musk perform experiments on rats that I didn't know? Does he?
Well, not rats, but actually
Okay.
non-human primates or monkeys.
Oh, with the
With the whole
Neuralink.
Neuralink, yeah.
Yes, we recently
Those
talked about
animals were
it.
tortured. Those
Oh my
animals were
goodness.
very much tortured. I could link you the actual. There's probably not something to read on stream because it's
No, no.
very
But if you
heavy,
could
but more for your
send it.
personal reading.
Mm.
Um, it's because it happened at an academic institution in the U.S. This wasn't just Elon in a secret underground monkey research laboratory. It was at University of California, Davis. They have an entire like primate research lab that Elon was able to essentially license out to do all of the Neuralink experiments, and
Mm.
those poor animals were literally tortured with that brain implant. Speaking of neuroscience, they didn't really get much data, if anything, out of it, and
Yeah,
8
he died.
animals lost their lives in a very
Yeah.
brutal fashion. So it's like, I don't know how we managed to get approval to do that in a human, but that's kind of a side conversation.
My struggle with these articles is again, maybe it's because I am a scientist, but I discussed it on stream. Anytime there's like a really cool new thing that came out in the news, whether it be the nuclear fusion, whether it be Neuralink, when I read them, they're very fluffy pieces. You know, there's nothing in them from a scientific perspective reading it. I got no information from our articles reading Neuralink, and we had a whole discussion about it. Now, are they hiding this information because, Neuralink is a private company and it's not going to publicize what they're doing because they don't want that information out there? Or is it because I'm in Ireland and I'm not Googling the right words to find the good articles? Do you know what I mean? Because it isn't.
Yeah, it's not on you that much, I'll say, because they somehow got FDA approval, government approval to
Mm-hmm.
move on to human trials. They have no peer-reviewed publications that a scientist could reasonably pull
No,
up
I
and
have nothing. I
evaluate.
couldn't find anything.
Nothing. There's nothing. I'm just as gobsmacked as you are. Somebody who's actually been trying to find like what data made the FDA comfortable saying, "Yep, you can do this in a person's brain." It's very concerning because they've expressed the desire to do this with disabled people, specifically
Yes, I saw
quadriplegics.
that. Yeah.
So it's like this feels like we're going down a very eugenics themed road very quickly without any data to support any of this at all, or at least if there actually is data, it is not publicly available. And I
No,
think
it's
the hallmark of good science means data that is peer reviewed, published, and accessible to the public, where
allowed to be
any old
disputed.
person
Yeah.
can. Yeah, exactly. Like if you have something good, or if you have science that is underpinning clinical trials, anybody should be able to access it, read it, and if there's points that can be challenged, I think anybody should have the ability to go forth and challenge it.
Mm.
And the fact that there's zero transparency in the situation makes me very nervous, and I'm scared that humans who are going to have that brain chip implanted are going to get hurt just as badly as the primates were, and and it will only be something that happens like comes out after the fact instead of preventing this from happening in the first place by not approving it
Yeah.
for human use, even in a trial situation. And the claims, at least for what the whole purpose is to
Mm-hmm.
try and potentially control a keyboard or mouse with your thoughts. I think there's other implants that kind of already do that already, that are already approved and were trialed. So this also feels redundant. Like, what is Neuralink doing that the other uh, implants that are already out there don't already do? So this very much feels like raising the profile of a company to either sell it or generate brand hype, and ultimately raise a stock price and profit rather than actually help people. That's how it feels to me.
Mm. Just one of my mods is jumping in to ask: is there any info on those alternatives? If I know we're like asking a lot of you already, you're sending so
Oh
many
no,
links.
totally.
We have a whole science posting chat in our Discord, so I'll post everything you sent so that I can share with my community as well. We're very open. Just to highlight that you are the first American on our Tofu Tech Talk, so it's really eye
Got it.
opening to see the other side of the world a little bit, but also like one of the leading side of the world, if it's not too bold of a statement as well. America is in the forefront of a lot of things. Whether it be bad or good is up to debate. But
I totally get what you mean. I'll
mm,
dig something up because one of my Twitch colleagues, who actually happens to be a CDC employee,
wow.
he actually had a bit of a Twitter thread about like some of the other entities on the market, that were essentially have predated Neuralink before any approval
Mm.
ever happened. So I'll dig up that information and send it to you for sure.
Really appreciate that. That's very good of you. Thank you so much. We're already actually kind of sinking in away from your research now and kind of talking a little bit more about the politics of science, which is your kind of area of your area of interest. Sorry to highlight.
Yeah.
My other guests they would talk about maglev trains or biomaterials, and yours is that you like the politics of science. Now, coming from someone like me, I'm not even someone like me. I guess anyone coming from a general audience perspective, there's politics in science. What does that mean? Just before we actually go into a bit more depth, what does it mean when we say politics and science?
Well, that's a really good question because I think a lot of people, not just like in the U.S., but kind of on a global level,
Mm,
they perceive scientists as sort of these like neutral arbiters of information, where we're kind of like the Supreme Court judge of biology or physics, where people call upon us when they need some information, we give them information, and that's the end of it. And I think that that perception really is very diametrically opposed to reality, right? Science has always been a big political venture, because ultimately, like science is comprised of people, right? We make decisions on what research to fund. We hand out grants to specific people for specific things. That's a consequence of people in a room discussing what science they value. And when
yeah,
there's people sort of making those judgments on like what science should be researched, what science shouldn't be, and how the institution as a whole kind of proceeds, a lot of how people make those decisions are ultimately derived from somebody's worldview. And politics is a very central thing to people's worldview, especially now, where things are very, very like polarized in terms of political systems across the globe. So science absolutely has been a function of politics over the years. One very recent example of this is whether or not we actually got mRNA vaccines for COVID in the first place.
what?
A lot of people made political value choices to not fund the researcher Catalin Carrico, who was at the University of Pennsylvania, who was trying to research how to use mRNA as a vaccine, to the point where she couldn't get grant funding for years. She got demoted. She was about to be fired from the university. They like
Oh
forcibly
yes.
relocated her office like all the way across campus to sort of try and make it harder for her to do her job and ultimately force her out.
Mm,
And thankfully, a collaborator who was a lot more like comfortable and well off saved the day, worked with her, and they both got the Nobel Prize because what they were working on was an actual
yes.
success. But people made the political decision to say, this isn't worth our time, your research isn't worth it, we don't like you, go away. And we almost lost out on a very valuable piece of technology because people in administrative and grant funding positions made a political choice to say, this isn't worth. And ultimately, that kind of, if we zoom back out from that example, a lot of how science has proceeded has been a function of politics and a function of sort of the greater politics of the time. And so, why I like to talk about the politics of science and why I think it's very, very relevant these days is, I mean, there's a couple of reasons. One, I think the entire institution is very much under a global right wing attack. The pandemic is a big
Mm,
example with anti-vaccine conspiracy theories and political entities on the political right, organizing against science, against academia to try and downplay the value and importance of science in broader society.
mm-hmm.
But I think there's also a component to be said for like how the institution has kind of proceeded in recent years. Like, you just graduated. I'm on the cusp of graduation, but we've both lived the grad student lifestyle. We both lived that life, and it's one where we do a lot of work. We don't make enough money compared to what we should be making for how much work we do. Me personally, what grad students get paid at my school was below the poverty line. Like, we technically qualify for food stamps, and we qualify for welfare programs because we get paid so little. And ultimately, like, that's a political
Damn.
decision. And to try and combat these kinds of things, there's a necessity for political organizing around a lot of the issues that we face in science. Um, and then I think, especially in America, because we're, again, the biggest example of this, but a lot of science is just commodified. Like, what gets generated is a commodity. Like, patents on specific drugs or gene therapies now with CRISPR coming into focus for curing disease. Like, a lot of that is now got a giant price tag affixed to it, and that's a consequence of our political system that has
Mm,
allowed large corporations in the pharmaceutical and biotech industries to take human biology and patent it, put a price tag on it, and sort of squeeze blood from a stone from poor people who are sick who need these things to live and to have a good quality of life. So everywhere I turn, basically, this feels like a giant political issue to me. I think I've lived it. A lot of grad students live it. A lot of faculty live it. Like I think there's a reason why, at least in the United States, there's a giant movement to unionize workers at every level, whether it's grad students, postdoctoral fellows, faculty. Tons and tons of places are actually trying to unionize to now combat these things, and that's a explicitly political thing. So, long story short, at every level, when it comes to like the research itself, how we do the research, what we decide is worth doing in the
funding,
first
yeah.
place, and then the structure of the system in terms of how grad students, postdocs, and faculty just live their lives trying to do science in current year, it's always been political. It's a giant political struggle. So I always have conversations with academics like this to basically say, like, a lot of what we need to do to make the system better is political action. Like we, scientifically speaking, we know a lot. Like we know often more than we really need to know for a given problem. But it's the politics where we need to actually, I think, invest more time and effort.
Very interesting. But I really liked how you were talking about how at different times and stages the politics changed, and so the push of science changed really. Because one of the things that I talk all the time on my stream is I mention all the time how I think the advancement of war is one of the biggest in push of a lot of physics. For example, I'm sure
Hmm.
like Oppenheimer came out this year and last year, sorry. The perfect example of how we barely understood the atom. Not even, to be honest, we were already developing the atomic bomb before we even understood the atom. But because it was needed, or supposedly it was needed, the push and strive for it just pushed it beyond compare. But if there was no war, that atomic bomb, nuclear energy, I don't think it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think like in sort of the popular culture, like Oppenheimer,
Mm,
um, that kind of put that into people's focus a bit. Where like exactly like you said, we didn't know the science and we already had the endpoint of war in mind and we were sort of trying to use science as a
yeah.
tool to arrive at that endpoint. And I think in the broader scheme of things, especially in the US, like a lot of our research funding comes from the Department of Defense. Like that is explicitly
Oh,
a
NASA comes from
military
that too,
branch.
right?
Yeah, yeah, I think NASA was a
I
spin-off
could be
of it.
wrong. I'm just asking.
I'll fact check that just to make sure, but um,
Yeah, we were talking
yeah,
quite recently.
it's
Yeah.
it's not quite part of it, but they've worked very closely
Mm,
hand in hand. So even if it's not literally a part of it, it's in spirit something that collaborates quite frequently with the DoD. Um, but as UTK says in the chat, like a lot of what the military wants to do is not in line with what people think science should be doing. Like
mm,
this is more of a people over profit and people over war kind of approach, where it's like a lot of this is supposed to be for the betterment of humankind, and what it's being utilized for is to do war better. Like a research project literally in my laboratory, which I really can't give you the details on. But
mm.
what I can say is it's a program designed to help soldiers adjust to jet lag. It's a DoD grant funded by the DoD. So
Okay.
like I've seen another grad student work on this project since it began, and I'm just looking at this and I'm like, the science itself is cool, but this is literally being used to help soldiers kill people better. And I'm just sitting here and I'm like, does anybody else realize, like, the ethical quandary here? Does anybody else, like, actually, like, understand and interpret this the same way I am? And it's difficult because when all the funding that exists is coming through an entity like the DoD for a lot of researchers, they're content to accept the outcome because it allows their laboratory to stay
Mm,
afloat, it allows them to publish, and it allows them to leverage that to apply for more grants to, hopefully maybe get a grant that's not through the DoD.
mm-hmm.
It's kind of this means to an end thing. And I really wish that the system itself wasn't structured where a lot of the research funding that you can apply for, at least in biology, is coming from the Department of Defense, right? The NIH
In
modular budget has
biology.
not changed since 1998, I want to say. So like the amount of money dedicated towards non-imperial research is not only very small, but it has not changed in decades. Whereas there's just tons and tons of money every year from the American Congress being given towards the Pentagon to the Department of Defense. And so that's why there's a ton of money for those kinds of grants that can be sort of spun and hand waved to do something for soldiers or for battle readiness. You'll see researchers often adjust what the purpose of their research actually is in the grant proposals to make it more in line with the mission of war and imperialism. And so that's why, again, the politics of science are super important, because if you have a more institutional resistance to how that works in the first place, you can at least engage in some grassroots advocacy to say, hey, it's kind of not cool for all of our money to be contingent upon improving our ability to do war. We need to fix this. We need to change this. And ultimately, there should be, movements of academics pressuring our Congress people, our political leaders, to not do this. But that's much easier said than done, I will readily admit.
Yeah, it's just coming from a person, I think, I don't know if this is going to be a shock to you. I'm from Ireland, I'm sure you know, but we don't even have a military. The things that you're saying about your military is just, I know that you're one of the top in the world, but we're on the completely other side where we don't even have, well, we supposedly have, but we don't really have a military here. We don't have military funding. We don't. So the whole application process for our funding in Ireland is completely different, that we don't go through that. We actually have a budget of research in Ireland that goes to. Now, I applied for that when I was doing my PhD and I didn't get it, but to each their own, and why you got rejected is completely random. But to me, it's such a shock to hear, just how much, like the fact that you said biology as well. I would have maybe understood engineering to a certain extent, having a military, which is a very simple concept. Weaponry and things like that has to do a lot with engineering and technical side. But the biology kind of makes me so scared, because not jumping on a conspiracy theory, but like biological weapons, right? That's
Oh
the
yeah, I
thing that I
mean,
go to straight away in my mind.
no, I think that's a reasonable thing to jump to, because we have had like a bioweapons program, especially in like the Red Scare eras, like from the 50s onwards, when
Mm,
you've had multiple global powers like competing for different scientific achievements. Like you can absolutely bet that both like the U.S. and the USSR in those days had bioweapons programs where they were trying to figure out what germs could they use to conduct a bioterrorism attack on a specific city. And academically, that conversation is kind of wild, but the
Resident
practical
Evil.
implications of that are terrifying. Yeah, it's pure unadulterated evil. And like when you understand the nature to which multiple governments have entertained that, you really start getting worried. If things were to continue to deteriorate, the tools that people have at their disposal as governments to do something like that now more than ever are very readily accessible and weaponizable. And that's why people hopped on the bioweapon conspiracy with respect to COVID,
Mm,
was because one, our cultures kind of popularized that with television shows and movies, but two, because there's at least a documented history of multiple countries trying to develop these things just to use as tools against the other in
yeah,
a global race for hegemony, essentially worldwide.
yeah. Very scary overall, but I suppose we're kind of leading into this part. We mentioned several times about the COVID, and it's one of the things that you talk a lot. I caught three full streams from you. You stream a little bit late, okay? I stayed up. I think I deserve a
I
pat on the
appreciate
back.
you
I
ruining
stayed
your
up.
sleep cycle for that.
um,
Thank you.
it was about COVID, and I clearly jumped in at a time that were leading on from a different stream. So it'd be really nice to kind of get a nice overview of your
Totally.
position and discussion about what happened with the pandemic. And no, we're not going to discuss the conspiracy theories, although I'm a big fan of conspiracy theories. Not that I support them. I talk them in my stream. I'm really excited anytime I hear a new one, just because to me it sounds fun. The
Yeah, it's
standard,
interesting to see how people think.
the batteries changing uh in the birds. That was I think my top number one favorite one that I heard. I think that was from US as well. But
Yeah.
there was a lot of mistrust during the pandemic. There was a lot of politics involved in the pandemic. And if you could give a nice overview of your discussion on your streams that you do about COVID, I'd really appreciate it, as someone who kind of jumped in the middle of it past.
Yeah, totally. Um, so this conversation is always very interesting because there's very much a wide gap between perception and scientific reality. Um, I can pretty firmly say that not only has science ruled out a laboratory origin for COVID of any kind, but the scientific consensus among experts in the field overwhelmingly points towards a natural origin of the virus. And that is because there is a very large body of evidence that actually suggests all of that. Um, So I think to go to Krogan's point that I see
Ah,
in the chat,
nice.
um, the research that was being done there wasn't gain of function. Like this has been a scientific definition that has been politicized heavily by American right wing politicians. What was going on there was not gain of function. There was one piece of data that showed an accidental gain of function result with a completely different virus, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus, or MERS. But that's unrelated to SARS-CoV-2 or SARS-CoV-1 in terms of direct relations. So what they were doing there was essentially trying to figure out like coronaviruses out in the wild and animal reservoirs, whether it was bats or raccoon dogs or other animals that can harbor these things, is whether or not any of those have human potential, right? Whether or not any of those could infect a person. So the reason why there's a laboratory in Wuhan is because a lot of the animals that harbor these viruses are in that province. Like they're essentially all of like Southwest China harbors a ton of bats that hold a very large diversity of coronaviruses in them chronically, which is again a big opportunity for them to jump into people given the right circumstances. So they went out into the wilderness to sample these things, and they had a system where they essentially took a mouse coronavirus that is adapted to mice, and they
Okay.
swapped the spike protein from the mouse coronavirus, and they put in the spike protein from insert virus that they harvest from the wilderness here, and infected cells in a petri dish and infected quote unquote humanized mice, which essentially have the human version of the receptor the virus sticks to instead of the mouse version. So
Oh wow.
they're essentially trying to assess human infectious compatibility between the virus in the wilderness and the human body. Um, so as a consequence of that, people look at that and they think, oh, well, people are making bioweapons. There's coronaviruses in this laboratory. Or, oh, well, people were doing research on this and they accidentally souped it up, or it escaped, or it jumped into a laboratory worker. And that very explicitly isn't true. Like there were not any shreds of evidence that anybody got sick. All of the workers were tested for antibodies against the virus, and they tested negative shortly after the pandemic began in the first place. And there's tons of evidence that in that marketplace in Wuhan, where all of this started, there were actual animal cages where animals known to harbor coronaviruses asymptomatically were kept. Like there was a giant animal trade in China. It's a $1 billion+ industry in China every year. There's a giant animal trade where animals are bought and sold for fur. Um, the animals in question have been documented to be like kept in that market for sale for many years, even prior to COVID. So every single piece of evidence basically points to two variants or two lineages of the virus emerging about 2 weeks apart in that lab in the marketplace rather in Wuhan. It's really incompatible with a laboratory origin because it would have
Okay.
required a laboratory worker to like get sick and then immediately go to the marketplace and start spitting on people. And it's like, no, that doesn't really work with multiple versions of the virus emerging at the same time. And then somebody traveling, 8 miles uh, uh, across the river to this specific marketplace, which nobody really goes to,
Mm.
just to spit on people, right? When you put all of the laboratory origin proposition together, it sounds like an episode of Looney Tunes. Like it just sounds like a very like slapstick comedy where a bunch of reckless scientists are spitting in each other's mouths, and then they get sick, and then they say, well, let's go to the marketplace and do it too. But in reality, like we have natural origin precedent for SARS-CoV-1. The animals that are known to harbor SARS-CoV-2 asymptomatically were in that marketplace. There's a whole industry dedicated towards selling them. And we actually have evidence that the cages that they were kept in had virus material on it from swabs that were taken like right when this was starting in the first place. So with all that being said, specific talking points about the lab leak and stuff, when people raise them, I'll entertain them to a degree, but there is a very big gap between the intimate details of what was going on in that laboratory versus what right-wing politicians worldwide, not just in the US, but worldwide, have made people think was going on in the
Mm.
laboratory. And there's a recent poll, I think, that came out 2 or 3 days ago, that experts in the field overwhelmingly show that they are very certain this virus has a natural origin, and very few of them actually believe it came from a laboratory, whether it was a deliberate bioweapon or an accidental leak into a person. Um, but when you look at what the American populace believes, it's the polar opposite. So that goes back to the politics of science because it's an issue that's been turned into a political football by politicians. So the citizenry has a very different view because of a lack of scientific literacy and the media pushing this message. But then when
Yeah.
you look at the experts, they think the exact opposite because they've had that training, they can understand it, they can parse it. So that's kind of the role of people like me, is to try and translate and communicate what's going on, why the experts think like that to the average person, so they can better understand like what the actual purpose of that research was and how it's kind of incompatible with the virus coming from a lab.
Mm. Thank you so much for informing that. I didn't know the details of all of that at all. Partially, maybe on my own end that I wasn't interested at the time, but education is always important, and it's really important to educate oneself. Um, there's a few people coming in. How much is this an issue of media literacy around science? King Egg is actually asking there.
It's a big deal. It's a very big deal. It's very easy for the average person just to say, yeah, they were playing with viruses in a lab and they got burned. Oops. That position requires very little effort and learning to arrive at, whereas trying to understand why scientists don't think that's the case and why it's highly likely that's not the case requires a lot more drawn out conversation, education about a little bit of biology, about what they were doing with viruses, swapping out the spike protein bits, kind of like I mentioned before, like different virus backbones and how they're adapted to mice instead of humans. Like there were very clear, concrete scientific steps that were taken, but like there is a big scientific illiteracy problem when people in the media don't want to sit down and talk to experts about that. It's easier to sensationalize and editorialize rather than learn. And as a
Mm,
consequence, the citizenry kind of falls into that bucket too when journalists don't really sit down and do their due diligence to actually talk to an expert and figure it out. One example I shared of this is a lefty journalist by the name of Ryan Grimm, who more or less is pretty decent on most other points, but he got victimized by the lab leak conspiracy theory like a year ago, and he's just been sounding like a right wing journalist ever since. Uh, which is very, very strange, but I think emblematic of the problem that we have, that there is a giant illiteracy problem even within the media between journalists. Um, and then in the broader citizenry, how the media really makes that problem worse
mm,
when they're deliberately pushing things that experts do not agree is happening, and when the experts do not agree that that's the consensus, right? What the media says is the opposite of what the experts believe.
yeah.
It's gotten so bad. There are specific journalists that harass experts on social media. So like I can tell you, there's like cliques. It's almost like high school. There's specific cliques of like pro lab
Yes.
leak journalists who then harass the
I
the
see this
the, the
stuff on
pro
Twitter.
natural origin scientists. Yeah, it's
It's always on
wild.
Twitter.
It's always on Twitter every time. Every
Yes.
time.
I'll jump in on that thought process in the sense that is it a conspiracy theory? In the sense that are they actually like purposely pushing this narrative, or is it just pure in education coming in? And let me like kind of rephrase it a little bit. In my example in my field, so I did wind turbines, I did batteries, I did the electric grid. That was my field of expertise. And in the news, I always hear all the time they talk about, oh, the reason we're not installing more wind turbines is because it's expensive. It's unethical to get the material to do so. They'll say all of this stuff. That's what they say on classical general media. But the truth of the
Mhm.
matter is, the physics actually isn't there. The electronics isn't there to introduce a lot more renewable energy onto the grid because it's a synchronous grid, and it's really hard to explain to a general audience in a 5-minute segment what the hell a synchronous grid is and why it's so difficult to introduce non-synchronous things. So I feel like, so my perspective is, I don't think, from an Irish perspective anyway, that the media is purposely being false, but rather it's just too hard to say the full truth. So I wonder, do you think that that's possibly a reason to a lot of these journalists and a lot of the information they're publicizing, or do you think they are actually pushing a narrative, a political narrative here?
I think it kind of depends on the person.
Okay.
I think there are some journalists who absolutely have married themselves to a political narrative. The example I give of the political narrative every time is the Wall Street Journal, because there's one journalist in particular by the name of Michael Gordon. Michael Gordon actually wrote a very instrumental article in, I want to say, 2001 or 2002. That was largely responsible for making the American public think Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
I
It
remember
was
that,
that
yeah.
article in particular that like got people on board with that. And then, a long story short, after a whole war, a surprise, there was nothing there. This is more or less a ploy just to, establish a presence in the Middle East and get oil. But it's that same guy who is very involved in that, manufacturing of consent for an entire war. Who, when the Wall Street Journal first reported on the lab leak and were very much in favor of that idea, that guy's name came right back up. He wrote every single article, and when you pull up his entire like body of work, he's written like at least a dozen articles over the last 2 to 3 years on the lab leak being real and alleged claims of smoking guns and things like that. But there are certainly journalists who do have a explicit desire like that guy to push a political narrative. I think a lot of journalists unfortunately fall in that political narrative
Oh,
um, understanding
it's
slash
unfortunate.
approach to all of it because it one it gets clicks, but two, um, there's an underpinning of politics and science, right? Because people then think that okay, they were doing spooky, scary gain of function research, which they weren't doing, but they think American tax dollars helped fund that, and that's an explicit question of the American NIH was collaborating with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Right, there was a middleman organization called EcoHealth Alliance that got NIH funding and then used some of that money to collaborate
Wow.
with the Chinese researchers in Wuhan. So there's a big question of did we America fund spooky scary research that created a pandemic? And that's why a lot of journalists like to run with the political angle because tax dollars are involved. So that's kind of the lens through which they see it is American scientists gone rogue or tax funding for science gone wrong, and that really creates anti-science animus and anti-intellectualism that's been running rampant. I think the average person comes at this from a perspective of a simple lack of understanding. So I think there's a big dichotomy between the media and the average person, right? The average person, they don't have scientific training. Most people are not scientists by trade, so they don't know, and I don't blame them for not knowing.
Of course.
This is why I often say like the institution of science, even though it's being kind of pilloried and attacked by the right, some of this is kind of the institution's fault too because we don't incentivize communication efforts, right? There is a giant void of communication trying to tell people like no, there was no gain of function research going on. This is how the research actually worked. This is what they were doing. Here's why it's incompatible with a laboratory origin. Like here's all the evidence. Here's what you should know. Nobody was doing that work. We don't incentivize people to do that work. People don't get paid to communicate. Like the best we got was Fauci going on TV, and that I think arguably made things worse and not better in some respects, especially with respect to the lab leak conspiracy. So because of that void, other people, including bad faith actors, the political right, conspiracy theorists who wear tinfoil hats, those folks are the ones who filled the void. So the average person only gets really exposed to pro lab leak conspiracy theorism, right? Their media consumption, what they log online and see is quote unquote smoking guns, things that are very simple, digested messages, easy to understand that support a conspiracy theory. Scientists weren't doing the work to combat that until it really boiled over into experts actually being harassed, right? When average people were so radicalized in America that people were trying to show up to Fauci's house and shoot him because they think he funded COVID research that started the pandemic in the first place. Like when people like Fauci had to get security details because people were so radicalized by a conspiracy theory, that's when the institution kind of realized there was a massive problem that we kind of have to deal with misinformation. I think some actors in the institution just kind of copped out and gave up. The former head of the NIH, Francis Collins, when he retired from being the head of the NIH, in his exit interview with like a more medical science news outlet, he was asked that question. He basically said like, "Are you surprised about all the misinformation and conspiracy theories about like COVID vaccines and the lab leak and all that stuff?" And he's like, "Yeah, I didn't expect that to be a big problem. I hope somebody fixes that. I'm leaving." So it's like the people in positions of power didn't incentivize communication work and we're paying a price for it, and their attitude still I think very much is too laissez-faire in terms of well people will think what they think, when you and I think we kind of realize that when we have opportunities to actually sit down and explain, what a synchronous grid is or what was actually happening at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, those are moments where we can actually give people a greater sense of understanding of the world around them and how things actually are working, why things are the way they are, that more material understanding of reality. And that is ultimately, I think, the bigger deal with respect to the average person. They just don't have the training, and they don't have anybody who's dedicated their lives and their time to getting that training,
Mm,
helping them out, right? They don't have scientists as pillars of the communities that they occupy. So
mm.
that's what's really cool about what we do is Twitch creates a space for those communities to organically form, so we can actually have those conversations in a meaningful way, as opposed to the more stern, condescending, lecturing scientist that shows up on TV sometimes that has to kind of explain this, where people kind of feel like they're being talked down to, or they're not really being taught this in a way that they understand. So I know that was a pretty long-winded answer to try and
No,
answer
no,
that
yeah.
question, but I really think there is a very stark dichotomy between the media and the average person.
Yeah, it's kind of heartbreaking your answer. Not that you answered it badly. It's just I was so hoping that there would be a bit of better faith in journalists, and you're of the opinion that actually they are politically driven, and not so much as that they're not. Like the example I gave, where I think it's just they don't understand, but it's not that they don't understand; it's that they are pushing
Yeah, they
what they.
can be made to understand. I mean, that's probably the saddest part is the journalists can be made to understand too. They just have to want to learn. And I think the incentive structure for journalists in the media is not conducive with learning.
And how come then that there was such a push, again, coming from someone from Europe who doesn't exactly feel what is happening in the States, if that makes sense? Yeah, sure, I
Yeah.
read about it, but I don't feel what's going on there. Um, when all of this debate and argument is happening, it seems that the right side is louder always, and
Oh
that's
yeah.
what we hear and things like that, and they seem to be showing the loudest that we have the proof, we have the theory, we have this evidence that this what happened in Wuhan was a lab leak. Are there scientists who are actually representing them, if that makes sense, representing that? Where they're getting their loud statements is my question. Are there
That
I know this sounds maybe a bit odd, but
No, no,
um
no. Your question's right on the money. Like, I'm actually really happy you asked that question. I jokingly call these people science chuds because there are like a
chuds.
handful of people with degrees, like actual PhD researchers,
Okay.
that lend credence to the conspiracy theories. And often you can see, in terms of analyzing the flow of misinformation, talking points sometimes come from these degreed individuals and makes its way to the broader political right. Right? They're very sinister in the way they craft things that are very much like short little sound bites, short little snippets, easily digestible talking points to make and agitate against the institution with. It's quite distressing to see that coming from like academics with tenure with
Mm,
PhDs, because the actual sort of content of their scientific arguments can easily be refuted and debunked in a couple of minutes. So it's not so much the things that they say actually have some sort of scientific relevance on this conspiracy theory, because there's usually something that you can instantly rebut with, but it's more that the people on the political right are so loud and agitating on this issue because they think, see, this researcher who has a degree agrees with me, right? He can't be wrong. He's a scientist. He has a PhD. He has an MD. Like, he knows what's going on. If there was no substance to this, why are these handful of people with degrees saying this? But then people need to then have that educational moment where they need to realize that scientific consensus kind of refutes that, right? When you have a handful of dissenters, well, okay, they're dissenters for a reason because most people think the opposite in the field, which is why that poll of experts that I alluded to that just came out a couple of days ago on this issue is making the pro laboratory leak people very angry and upset because they've been led to believe that because of their favorite science chuds on Twitter that they follow, and have the conspiracy sort of drip fed to them via their Twitter feed every day, is not reflective of scientific consensus at all. So it's a very interesting flow. Like, I can name the handful of academics off the top of my head that are pushing this very heavily, and it becomes very apparent that even they are doing this for clout, Twitter attention, follows, social media presence, because those academics are coordinating harassment of other academics that disagree with them. I think one in particular from Fred Hutch actually works with right wing politicians in Congress to try and feed them talking points too, which again you can follow the flow of information from that
mm,
one academic to people like Rand Paul, for example, in Congress. This manifested like about a month ago. There was actually a hearing that Bernie Sanders held on long COVID, and one Republican senator just derailed the entire thing for like 20 minutes straight because monopolized the conversation to start talking about the lab leak. He basically said, I'm sorry, all of you have long COVID. This is because Anthony Fauci funded gain of function research, and then he just started rambling for like 20 minutes on conspiracy theory talking points. And based on the things coming out of his
They
mouth, I'm like, I
redirect
know,
away from the topic usually in these things, and that's why people get deterred. Is
yeah,
that it?
yeah, like they shouldn't be talking about that in a congressional hearing, but like
Mm,
I guess the broader point is the academics in some cases, when they hop onto the conspiracy theory train, they seed the misinformation, and you can see those seeds germinate in the minds of politicians and on people who consume their social media feeds online. It's
mm,
like that's where they're getting it. That's
mm.
where the information comes from, is specific academics who are kind of dissenters and do not agree with the consensus, but ultimately they have no substance to their talking points, and there's a reason why the consensus is the way it is.
Yeah, that's actually just so heartbreaking when you think about it ultimately because let's say again, I know my little niche, I know my little research, but you came here on my show, you are a biologist, you're sharing all of this information from your area of expertise, and I'm putting my trust in you to speak I suppose ultimately it is your truth, but speak from your perspective what your truth is, and to hear that scientists around the world aren't speaking their truth and instead are, I guess the term might be bought out in a weird way if they're pushing a certain agenda and things like that. I'm sure we're saying this from a more left perspective. I'm sure the right would say the same thing about us, right? What we're saying now, like this is a double-edged sword or a double-edged argument, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I
S-
mean, they claim that we're all part of a big virology shadowy cabal in a back room to do
oh,
bioweapons research or something like that. So that's
is
largely what the
that what
political
the
right would say
argument
about
is?
us.
Oh wow.
Basically, yeah, we're all part of big virology to cover up gain of function research. That's literally the substance of their argument. Like
Okay,
when
that's
you hear
new.
that, you laugh because it's absurd, and most scientists do laugh because it is absurd. That's why the consensus is not there, because the scientists realize we don't get grant funding at all. We don't. There's no conspiracy to get grant money because there is no grant money. We don't have anything. We're broke. We're poor. A
We're
lot of
very
virology
poor.
research can't even get funded. So it's like, really, we're doing this for grant money. We're covering up gain of function research for grant money. What grant money? We don't have any.
Mm. Just before we continue, I do want to jump in that how are you on time? You okay to continue for a little while longer, or
Oh yeah, I could do this all day. So your stream. You're the captain of the ship. So
I just
I'm
wanted
good with what you want.
I just wanted to make sure before we continue. Thank you so much for sharing a lot of eye opening things. Again, these are things that I wouldn't be able to discuss on my stream because again, area of expertise, field of expertise, things like that. But so many things that you highlighted today was very interesting to me because just a couple of days ago, we were talking about Neuralink on the stream, and I literally went off a
Hmm.
rant that I was pissed off that I didn't learn anything, basically, after reading all the articles. And then I think the day later, which was my last stream I did, we talked about about the American government and the money they're spending on military. So the timing of you coming here and like reiterating a lot of these things is actually phenomenal. I can't believe. Of course, we're
It
just
worked out
hoping
really well.
brilliant, absolutely brilliant. For my from my chat's perspective, to have learned a lot here, or not even learned, top up their knowledge from the other day. Yeah, we were talking about a scary, not a scary thing, but the way the capitalist America view again. We're all on the West, but America is a very capitalist country in comparison to the rest of Europe. Um,
Hmm.
it's the extreme of the other side, and we're talking about again, kind of similar to biology. Correct me. I'm sure you know the story. There was a story of a medicine that had an opportunity to be used with pregnant women or women who are about to give birth. There was a lot. I think you know where the story is going, right?
Yep.
Where they put the
Yep.
money instead, all the funding and all the dough into Viagra. Is that the story? Could you? Because I mentioned it briefly on my stream. I know this might be a bit of a rant, but I do go on rants a lot. If you could rephrase it, if you know that story,
Yeah.
and
So I mean, I
stories
think
like that.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of like a portmanteau of two stories put together.
Oh
Like
yeah.
I think Tetsu kind of alluded to the medicine in pregnant women. That was the thalidomide story, and this was back in
Oh.
like the 50s. Um, where like obviously like technology and everything was nowhere near what it is now, but it was essentially a medicine given to pregnant women for like morning after sickness. It was meant to help that, and to some extent it did, but what people then found out was that like this medication is actually a carcinogen, and not only like caused the pregnant people to actually get cancer, but also like resulted in severe birth defects
Oh, jeez.
with respect to the baby. So um, that's an old time example of like, oh, science did something terrible and people got hurt, and like, yeah, of course that
Oh,
was
okay.
terrible and people got hurt,
Mhm.
but like people understood why people got hurt in the first place, and we stopped doing that. So that's kind of a very classic example of how people can learn about how dynamic science actually is, right? When the understanding changes, sometimes the approach and the takes change. So when people figured out that this medication was actually like causing birth defects and giving people cancer, they stopped using it, which is of course the correct thing to
Yeah,
do.
of course.
The Viagra story is also kind of interesting. Um, they were trying to, I think, develop a blood pressure medication. And the Viagra thing was a very accidental discovery. They
Oh,
figured out
yes.
that you could sustain erections because of taking this medication. So they figured out that, oh hey, now we can kind of develop this little cottage industry around erectile dysfunction because we made this discovery about Viagra. Um, and that also kind of reflects the very like male centric nature of how a lot of science has
Yes.
come to be, where
Mm-hmm.
like pregnant women were being given this drug that ultimately wound up hurting them and their fetus. But with Viagra, that was very much a like, oh, cool, male specific side effect. All right, let's turn this into a big thing. It took years to quote unquote develop the female Viagra, and I think for some people that does actually work. Like that is a thing.
There's a female Viagra?
Um, but
let me
like,
let me write that
see
down.
exactly that's what I mean. Like people don't even realize that that even exists. Like
What?
it's a
Where have I
thing.
been living?
um
This is a
yeah.
very educational talk. I appreciate hashtag worth. All right. Sorry. Keep going. Apologies.
But like what's wild about it is like, male Viagra is one of these things where like it's an entirely separate class of medications with one specific mechanism. But now there's this like female Viagra, which is essentially like a repurposed antidepressant. So like they figured out that this actually has some effect on decreased sex drive in women, and it does help some of them. So that's why I think they approved it for this off label use. And so
Damn.
like they the premise of like we accidentally found an erectile dysfunction medication due to blood pressure research then led to this whole like idea like, is there a female equivalent, like what can we do to figure that out too. um so like a lot of medication discovery is either like accidental or again based on notions that are not quite as scientific as people would really expect them to, right? There wasn't some group of researchers trying to sit down and really tackle the issue of libido, right? These were things that just happened on accident. Discovering the first antibiotic was literally an accident because a dude left a petri dish full of
Yes.
bacteria open, and he noticed that fungus, from the air settled in the petri dish and killed the bacteria. So,
Mm.
just so much in science, in biology
Yeah.
especially, because it's
Oh,
super messy. It just happens on accident.
most of physics as well. Like I know so many anecdotal stories of everything accident. Like from electricity perspective, the fact that we knew that there was electricity and bodies were found was completely accidental. It was frogs left out on the kitchen table. That's literally how we found that there was some sort of electrical impulses. I don't know if you know the story about
I
Galvani.
don't.
Yeah, so he was studying. I think it's the 1800s. Mixing up my years. But it was this big competition between Alessandro Volta. It was in Italy, but his wife got sick, some very very a bad illness,
Mm.
and she has to stay home. And so while Galvani was doing the experiments, he was in the kitchen,
Huh.
and they ended up accidentally touching from one end to the other end metals of a frog, and they discovered that current went through a frog, and that's how we know that there's some sort of circuitry based in animals, and this is where animal electricity came. Yeah, there's a whole story. That was a complete accident.
That's wild. That's wild. It just accidentally zapped a frog.
The course of this, the effects of this is matcha crazy, because basically because Galvani discovered that, he published this big paper about animal electricity, and then Alessandro Volta was like, hold up, this isn't real, let me prove it to you, and he built the first electrochemical battery. The, like the what happened from this little accident is wild.
Seriously,
Yeah,
that
there's a
is
whole.
wild.
So don't worry, it's not just biology. Physics is all just accidentally done too.
Yeah, I mean, there was the whole like superconductor thing where people claimed they had found it or like accidentally made it. I remember a little while ago with the new room temperature superconductor thing, and that couldn't be replicated as much. But like, so many things are just like when people are unable to be curious and like just test things out, ideally within ethical boundaries, of course. You learn so much. It's just messing around, and that's kind of what a lot of science is. You mess around and you find out, but in a controlled, ethical way.
Yes, yes. Preferably with less lab rats and mice.
Yes, ideally, minimizing animal harm as much as possible.
Thank you again for re-clarifying and retelling the stories accurately, because I was spreading misinformation, it seems, the other day. Well, not misinformation, just not
No,
exact
no, I mean
accurate details.
things like that I wouldn't even call misinfo.
That is absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for everything that you shared today. Is there anything I'll definitely ask chat, by the way, to participate and ask questions? But is there anything that I didn't probe with question wise that you're interested in sharing? Maybe you don't have anything on top of your head, of course. But was
No,
there
I mean
something that we left?
I think we covered a lot of bases. I mean,
Mm,
usually in conversations like the one we have, I tend to kind of like, especially with like other academically minded folks, I kind of try and like zoom out a little bit because oftentimes like we really get a lot of detail, right? We're talking about facts, papers, research. But I encourage people, especially as it pertains to like the politics of science, to kind of zoom out a little bit and just kind of appraise how much of like what we do and what we like to learn about has really just been kind of like grasped and taken a hold of by like a very like hyper capitalistic economy where a lot of this is just commodified, turned into patents, turned into money making tools for people much richer and more powerful than us. So what I encourage people to sort of think about is like try to conceptualize in your head, and I know it's very difficult to think, but like what or how rather could we do science and have like a scientific system that didn't really work like this? Like what would a more idealized form of science look like? And things that I kind of communicate to people is like, especially if we're talking like academia, right? Wouldn't it be awesome if people didn't have to like make their research all about war to get funding? Like, wouldn't it be awesome if like because of all of the suffering of getting a PhD, you were given like government money just to have a lab in the first place if that's what you wanted to do, like
yeah, I
having like a
feel.
laboratory basic income type of deal, like that kind of approach where it's like we could be so much different, like the academic system could just be wildly different than it is, but like the way we organize the economy I think really gets in the way. I really encourage people to sort of think more about like the politics of science, and for
Mm,
people in academia to think about like, do you have a union? Are you part of a workers union? If not, can you like sit down and find some like-minded people who might be willing to actually sit down and organize one? That's something that we've done on my university campus. I
that's
found a
amazing.
couple of people like this 5 years ago when I started, and even though I burnt out a couple of years ago on that organizing work, other people kind of picked up the mantle, and sooner rather than later, sometime this year, we'll probably have a vote to ratify it and get a contract. So, our system can be, I think, improved upon and reformed. I think, the institutions of science and academia are two of the institutions that are very worth reforming and not just like burning to the ground and
Mm,
building up again. But I think it requires a lot of like work and creativity and ingenuity from like academically minded people to sort of re-envision an academia that is not really like shackled or constrained by capitalistic incentives of you have to publish, you have to patent, you have to sell this, or your entire laboratory career will come to an end. Um, we can have it function a lot differently, and so I want people to sort of think about what that world looks like, especially in their little neck of the woods when it comes to academia, because I think science and scientists would be a lot better off for it, having the actual ability to not publish or perish, to actually do the
mm,
research that they're interested in, and ultimately use their knowledge, their training in that research to help people, right? We can
yeah.
create a system that is more focused on helping people, and less constrained by profiteering and capitalism sort of corrupting what science was originally about in my world. So that's my little spiel. I tend to give that spiel when the politics of science comes up, when I'm talking to
It's
other
a good one.
academically minded folks. So
Yes. If you ever, whenever you pass away, have it on your tombstone. That whole. That'll be the last point to make before we go, to make sure. Yeah, it is. Just on that topic, it's so heartbreaking to hear how very little researchers get paid, and the whole in a weird way, even though it's not exactly what you said, because again the politics is different in Ireland and things like that.
Hmm.
It was actually the politics of university that completely destroyed my science and research mind. I'm just graduated, like I said, and taking a small break doing this social media
Fair.
thing, whatever it is. But I don't think I'll do a postdoc. I realize that I think
Yeah,
it
I'm in
broke
the
me a
same
little
boat.
bit.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
if I could avoid doing a postdoc, I would love that.
yeah,
I do not want to do it. I feel you. Truly, I think like you said, even the politics of university, even at a smaller level, it's just a microcosm of everything I mentioned in that spiel.
yeah.
Plus some additional stuff on top of that,
Yeah,
where
there's
certain
weird.
individuals can make things not so nice.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. A few people have chimed in with a few questions. I don't know if you have the stream
Yeah,
open. Do you
totally.
have the chat?
Yeah, I've got the chat open.
Yeah. So
Um, I could.
first question was, what was the most frustrating thing that could happen because of politics? That might be an open-ended question, so I don't know if you have something ready on your mind.
Oh,
Um.
I usually do.
Oh.
I can be a hot take generator sometimes. Um, What is the most frustrating thing that could happen because of politics? I mean, for me, because of politics,
Oh. I think it's on.
b because of COVID, we've seen tons of unnecessary, like, preventable death and disability. Like, politics on the right have steered people away from vaccines, and, that can absolutely prevent death in a lot of respects. And then I would say, actually, politics with the Biden administration in particular has steered a lot of people away from mask wearing, which is something that absolutely prevents a ton of infections, and there's still value in doing that because of long COVID, where, 10% of people who get COVID their first time come down with long COVID, right? Permanent uh, symptoms that reduce quality of life and can sometimes outright disable a person and prevent them from working and doing what they like.
Mhm.
And politics has made the science take a back seat because the politics on the right was vaccines bad, I hate them, they're going to make me explode or something. And then politics on the left has been vaccines good, actually all you need to do is get them, when the actual science says you should get your vaccines. You absolutely need that, but like you have to do a little bit more than that to actually, keep COVID at bay until we get higher quality vaccines and a
Mhm.
new generation of vaccines to prevent infection more readily than the vaccines that we currently have. So like, mask wearing and clean air, like those are things that have a ton of scientific data behind them, but were rendered controversial because of politics, where a left wing administration with the Biden administration would actually have to invest in that with taxpayer money to bring those things to fruition. Right. This is culminated multiple times with like the press secretary of the Biden administration scoffing at reporters asking like, should people be wearing masks right now? And they're like, no, we have vaccines. What do you mean? We're not going to send people masks. And then the president gets COVID repeatedly. The CDC director gets COVID repeatedly. Like, eh, it's been very ridiculous and very frustrating for me personally, since I have all this science understanding and I had it when this started. Right, I wore masks and told my family to wear masks at the very start, but when you have the likes of Fauci saying don't wear a mask, I'm sitting here like having an aneurysm. I'm like, no, what do you mean? And with time, that came to be a political thing rather than a scientific one. So for me, it's when politics drive the response to something like this and the science is forced to take a backseat. Like, science should dictate how we craft policy. Like, material reality is dictated by science is the best set of facts and information with which you can craft policy. So to see politicians just look at that, discard it in favor of the economy has been incredibly distressing and frustrating for me. Um, to see actual like aerosol science experts, physicists who are very well versed in particle physics, who have been shouting this from the rooftop since the beginning, be ignored by both political parties here. But the broader schema of that is when politicians drown out scientists and ultimately craft policy that is anti-scientific or
Mhm.
ascientific. That's incredibly frustrating to me to see, because I've been watching this happen for the past couple of years. Um,
Yeah.
oh, hi, Double Trouble.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's the
what
next
could
question.
what can motivate all of these industries to keep people ignorant about disease prevention? Yeah, and that's just economic profit. That's profit motive.
Ah,
When
Ferengi,
people
Ferengi mindset.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally just when you keep people in the dark about, the dangers that might be posed by something like long COVID, then they'll feel content to just get some vaccines and then go do the stuff that they want to do and stimulate the economy while they're doing it, right? That's what the politicians cared about the most. I know, like the UK had a big COVID inquiry, and people like Boris Johnson were literally have found to said in private chats to like, yeah, we don't care if the old people die, let everybody get sick. The
Oh,
economy
they had a
matters
whole
more. Like they were,
party. They had a whole party. There was a whole thing in the
yeah.
UK about that.
Oh yeah, they had lockdown parties. Yeah, Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson, they were having lockdown parties while telling everybody else to lock down, while then saying privately that they're okay with everybody getting sick and dying for the sake of the economy. So it's like, the way that the economy is organized makes politicians just wild out and do crazy things like that and drown out the scientists in the process. Um,
Perfect,
yeah,
perfect answer.
let me go to the next question.
Yeah, so in terms of
Um,
DoD funding, if you were given the
yeah.
power, how would you restructure? Just in broad concepts. How do you is there an idea? Do you have an idea in your head how it could
Oh,
possibly work?
absolutely. Because a lot of the DoD funding is a consequence of like in the United States how we give like $800+ billion a year to the Pentagon. Just don't do that. Like we need to just redistribute some of that money from the Pentagon to the NIH, right? Money that is going to fund research solely for the sake of helping people rather than having this imperialistic character to it where you have to adjust or qualify your research to make it fit the bounds of war in order to get funding in the first place. So really just a budget allocation, right? Defunding the Pentagon and giving more money to the NIH, I think would go a long way. Taxing the rich would also help like add more money into the system in the first place
When I
because
learned
good
about
lord.
that, oh my days, I used to think I had a very bad mindset. But again, I very very young, immature. I was growing up in Ireland. I was like, I don't understand. They're the rich, fine, they're billionaires, but they're taxed the same 42% that we are. Then I was like, oh, 42% they're not taxed. I was very shocked to hear that they don't get taxed at all. Almost, yeah.
Yeah, they have new and creative ways to evade and dodge taxes at every turn, and the system lets them get away with it because it's difficult to hold them accountable and find all the secret places that they hide their money and stuff. So it's easier just to go after the common person who doesn't have that much money to hide or cheat taxes with in the first place. And of course, the rich can lobby the politicians to create nice little loopholes and exemptions for them. But just having more money to work with in general to address that issue of like why or how rather we could fund scientific research without the DoD being involved. Defunding the Pentagon, number one, and then taxing the rich, number two, just creates so much more money in the system that you can play with, and you can just juice up the NIH, the NSF, and other sort of explicitly scientific and not imperialistic agencies. That way, they have more money to actually give out. Even beyond that, kind of going back to my idea of laboratory basic income, even if you just have a giant pool of money and you just give X amount per year to every research lab, that would be cool. So that way, you're not depending on a bunch of people in a room saying your research is worth funding. As long as you're not doing anything horrendously awful with your research, you have all the proper ethical approvals. I think you should be entitled to laboratory basic income every year as an academic research outfit, regardless of
Damn,
discipline,
that'd
because
be a
that
dream.
it would really be a dream. I think there's in America at least we have so much money circulating and so much money that could be reclaimed from taxing the rich that could be a reality. So that's my idea, my
Mm.
pet project as to how we fix
So
that problem.
Pentagon and eat the rich. I mean, tax the rich.
I mean, why not both in a video game, of course.
I see. And I guess the final question I saw was I have a question that I promise is not a bait, huh, King? But does hard science at times miss the human communication element of their work? Wonder what.
Oh, 100%. That is a very timely question because I came back from a conference yesterday. And my God, I felt like a lot of the colleagues, like academic colleagues, people who were supposed to be my peers, like other grad students,
Mhm.
undergrad students, even some of the faculty, I felt like I was talking to video game NPCs. It was the most bizarre, like, I almost felt like I was having an out of body experience. It was so strange because what I was like, we had a poster session, and
Oh,
for those of you
nice.
in chat who aren't familiar with what poster sessions are, researchers basically put a summary of their projects on like an actual poster, hung up by poster board, and then they stand next to it for an hour or two while people come around and ask what the research is about or ask questions about the posters, and they have little competitions and people get awards and prizes for like best poster.
Yeah.
It's just one way some of the people try to communicate research at conferences. It's a really good way for like undergrads and
Yeah,
grad
it's
students to
perfect.
sort of
Yeah,
get their feet
exactly.
wet for communication. But what was very strange to me was I would go up to people and I'd be like, oh, I like this specific thing on your poster, or I don't understand this like specific method on your poster. Can you explain like what this like mouse behavior task is to me, or like why are you studying this specific pathway in the first place? And what they would do, which was just the most bizarre thing, is they would just give me the entire spiel of every single thing that they did from the start to the finish. I was like, that's not the question I asked you. I asked you specifically about this one thing, and you ranted at me for 15 minutes straight without letting me stop you and be like, I didn't need all of this. I was just asking about this one thing. I was interested in one little detail, and they just vomited the entire contents of their poster at me verbally. So I had that experience with everybody at every single level, undergraduate,
Yeah.
graduate, and faculty. So to me, and this is kind of reflective of my experience in my PhD program, we took one semester long science communication class.
Oh,
And
wow.
that entire class was literally just writing up your own research, but in a different format. Sometimes it's, a fake press release. Sometimes it's an actual like layperson summary. Sometimes you're pretending to write a letter to a politician. But the entire class was just like saying your research, but different. And it's like, there's so much more to science communication than just repeating your research, but different. Like, you have to have some degree of like charisma, public speaking ability. You have to relate to other people. And a lot of that manifested at that conference for me, where I'm just sitting there and I'm like, you're tenured faculty. Where did you learn to talk to other people? This isn't how you talk to other people, by just regurgitating a script at me. Like you're going through a video game character dialogue tree where it doesn't matter what I'm asking or what I'm telling you. You just say the same thing. So to go back to the question of like how a lot of hard science, quote unquote, is devoid of humanities and devoid of communication skills, I would agree with that 100%. Yes. I think there's ways around this though, but I think it requires a lot more creativity and ingenuity than what a lot of the quote unquote hard science people would be willing to actually implement in like a training program for grad students. So, um, one exercise we did in our science communication class, which I wish we would have done every day, we actually did improv. Like we didn't do any talking about our research at all. We just did improv, kind of like whose line is it anyway style, to sort of break the ice, to loosen people up, and to get people thinking about like
Mm.
how to sort of creatively restructure things, reword things to fit the bounds of particular conversations. Things like that kind of help people get in that mode of like just talking to another human being, being real, being genuine. Don't just rehearse the script of your research because that's what you're here to do, is do research. Like at the end of the day, what we do is funded by taxpayers, at least in a lot of ways here in the US. So it's like you have to be able to actually step outside of a laboratory, step outside of the ivory tower, and be able to talk to people on the street about your work, about what you do. Right. I'm biased because I get a lot of practice 2 times a week on Twitch. So like
Yeah.
that I don't want people to interpret what I'm about to say as a flex, but like there were more
Yes.
people in my Twitch chat than there were at this conference I was at yesterday. So like for me to go up there, give a talk for 15 minutes, answer questions, and then go into the poster session,
Yes.
for me, my Twitch chat put me through the ringer, through the communication training harder than I ever have been in my academic program, harder than I ever will be at a lot of these conferences. So it's like
You're
we could
absolutely
do
right.
so much better. We could do so much better in training programs for grad students, where we could actually teach people how to talk to one another in a way where you don't even talk about your research once, right? Literally, it's just a public speaking class would be a nice start.
Absolutely. You're
Um,
so right.
but it's like we have that void where that's not incentivized. People don't want
Minor inter-
much the rehearsing the script type. So it's like, you know, I want to get ideally in my career, right? If I can get like a little teaching side gig, right? I want to teach people about, politics and philosophy of science, and ultimately like science communication. Like have people go through those exercises as grad students to learn how to talk to human beings. Because a lot of what we do, like we're holed away in laboratories, we're holed away in conference rooms, writing grants, studying, doing math. Like a lot of what we do isn't talking to people. And I think just having like science conferences being the vehicle with which we talk to other people and practice those skills is wantonly insufficient. So yes, in hard sciences, we need greater integration with humanities
Absolutely.
and more science communications. That way we have well-rounded scientists who actually can like have a conversation with other people.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely. Everything that you said is almost everything I would agree and would have said the same, if not so elegantly as you put it, for sure. Throughout my years of my master's and my PhD, I did get quite a lot of compliments of my public speaking ability. Um, and then people would say, oh, it's because you're a teacher. So my bachelor's was actually in teaching. I actually got a physics and chemistry teaching degree. And they would downplay it to say that. But honestly, I think it was Twitch that freaking helped me a lot. Like,
Yeah.
just to put in perspective, I had to teach some physics lectures. I have more people in my chat, like 3 times more people in my chat than I ever had in a physics lecture to teach. Just to put it in perspective, Twitch has been amazing in communication, and
Truly.
I think it's also. I'll just add a little thing, and I want to see your input about it. And this kind of goes a
Sure.
bit into the politics. I have a suspicion that it's also an extension of how universities hire lecturers. That you're already nodding your head. I think you know where I'm going with this. They
Yeah, go ahead.
hire lecturers with a high H index. They hire those with high funding, high whatever. And I'm sorry, like in my experience, I've seen the most supposed academic, most highest achieving person with their back turned to the audience reading off the PowerPoint. This is the
Mhm.
peak, supposed communication of science and things like that, and this is how they speak to people, and then people wonder why people aren't interested in science and technology and STEM and just anything, like not even interested to do a career in it, but just interested to learn, because I think we always have to learn no matter what field we're in.
Yeah,
So
and, like, a lot of us, like, when we are asked, like, "Why did you go into academia?" Physics, biology, like, "Why
mm,
did you do that in the first place?"
Star
Oftentimes, we'll
Trek.
recount that, like, a teacher inspired us or, yeah, like, even a popular media inspired us, like a Bill Nye or a Star Trek,
mm,
like, those are fundamentally communication based like memories and
yes.
experiences that we had that like drive us into this in the first place. Like, I can recount, teachers I had in high school who got me super interested, and it wasn't because like the contents of the class was so incredibly riveting that I couldn't do anything else. It was because
mm,
those people made it interesting for me. So it's like I really wish we kind of remembered a lot of why we're doing this in the first place. Because, like you said, the system is structured in a way where people who bring in grant money for the university to take overhead from, those are the people who get hired to teach and do research. And their lack of communication ability manifests when they have their back turned to the entire audience reading verbatim from a PowerPoint.
mm,
And that's kind of sets up a positive feedback loop where, like, that's not inspiring. People are going to get tuned out and uninspired when that's the lion's share of who comprises academia. When a lot of people are like that, people are going to look at that and be like, ew, no, this is boring. This sucks. I'm going to go do something else. If you have people who are good communicators who can actually make people more invested in the science and the knowledge and in the
yes.
learning, exactly as you described, then we can actually, I think, address a lot of the anti-intellectualism, anti-science animus that we have in society. Like when people want to know more and they learn, then people figure out like, oh, hey, this science stuff isn't so bad. Like they have some really good ideas and we should listen to them a little bit more instead of ignoring them and then bad things happen as a result. So it's like we have the ability to change this. I honestly think incentivizing communication work would solve a fair amount of problems. The time scale would be quite long because you would need to train, new generations of
Yeah,
scientists to
you have to
actually
start young.
have these skills. But yeah,
Mm,
you got to start young and you got to start ASAP. So, science communication from the top to the bottom, even if it's just, getting little kids interested by just showing them some like really cool science experiments or getting them interested in nature or animals or creatures. Like, yeah, more of that. We need to fund more of that, right? We need to actually have more of that work being done, so people understand that we're not out here just trying to scam taxpayers for grant money, but we're trying to help, right? We want to make the world a better place.
Thank you so much for that insight. I really appreciate everything that you said today. Unless there's anything else you have to add, we're approaching towards the end of the talk. Um, it
I
honestly has
think
been
I
so
think Jimmy
amazing. Oh, yeah?
Jimmy has a good question.
Oh, sorry.
Just asking like how much public outreach for science education do research institutes typically do? Little to none. Like it's almost non-existent. The only public outreach I've ever seen academia do was my one of my old research mentors personally deciding to take the laboratory to a local high school to talk about like science and what college is like. Like that was it. Usually it's individuals in academia who make that choice to do
Yes.
outreach work rather than the institution saying, "Here's some money so you can take the time and do some meaningful outreach work." So it's just kind of a bummer that like we have to take the initiative and often not getting paid to do it to actually do it. And then I think King Egg also says,
Mm.
how much of the earlier mention of media illiteracy is caused by this lack of communication skills? I would say to some degree, like, I mean, it's a contributing factor. Like, not having science literacy as a general non academic member of the public that is going to be an issue. But also having some degree of media illiteracy, even as like an academic, which I think COVID has certainly showed a lot of people who are academics but not virologists have shown their scientific illiteracy very, very prolifically over the past couple of years. But and that manifests too when you don't have knowledgeable people communicating what's going on in a given domain of science, whether it's physics or virology or anything in between. A lot of the other academics are also just kind of tuned out and don't really understand what all is going on. So you need people doing communication work in every discipline. So that way, even within academia, we have a greater collective idea of like the general state of other fields. Like, there's a hot new discovery in physics. Like, my background is in physics. I might go to someone like Tofu to be like, hey, this cool thing happened. Can you tell me more about it? And like, that's a good conversation. But academics don't usually have those kinds of conversations with each other. We're all very stuck in our own world and siloed, and we don't really talk to each other. So
Mm,
even intra academia communication is something that very much falters too.
absolutely. I don't know anyone outside the little, not even physics, just the little sphere of my little research group of my little thing. Which is of course thousands of people, but you just don't really go out of it. You really do stay in that little eggshell, that little
Yep.
protective layer bubble. But yeah, little talks like this is really exciting as well, because I learned a lot today. I usually end my science and technology segments with asking chat what they learned, and they usually list off the most vulgar and the most inappropriate stuff they learned. So I'm guessing we all learned that there was female Viagra, right? Right,
Yeah, I was
chat?
about to
That's
say
what we, yeah.
it's female Viagra and thalidomide or something.
That's what we learned today.
But sometimes those are the things that resonate because you can
Mm,
usually talk about those stories and leverage them to make sort of
exactly.
greater, broader points. So
And
it's always fun when people take away various bits from conversations like this.
I'll also in future my lab rats misbehave in chat. I will be threatening them. I'm going to send you to Homozygoat stream if you misbehave, chat. That's where I'll be
Uh,
sending you my lab rats.
yeah, we could do some proverbial brain harvesting if y'all step out of line.
Oh, absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on to Tofu Tech Talk. Again, this is a newly kind of thing that I started doing after I graduated. I'll try it out for the next year. And having you on as a guest has been such a thrill. You're so amazing at speaking. Specifically, it starts off like you might be losing, like that you might be going on a tangent, but you're not. You need to teach me this because I go on a tangent and I don't stop. But you seem to pull it back in every single time. It's a skill. It's an art form. I need to learn this.
Yeah, I mean, it just takes so much practice. I mean, when I first started streaming a couple of years ago, it's very much a situation where, there's like two people in the chat. So you're more or less just kind of rehearsing into the void. I mean, that's essentially how this skill develops is you just got to practice, practice, practice. And I would say you're pretty adept at it too, because you can you can pose questions to chat. Like that's what's really cool about Twitch is you can interact with
Yes, it's a
with a group of
two-faced.
people. So
Yeah.
you're very good at sort of creating that like two-way conversation, basically saying like, what do we think about this? Because like this thing I've been thinking about lately. What do we think? Like even that is, I think, a really good way to get conversation started. So the fact that you've been doing this on Twitch for as long as you have, I think that's a sign that you're also, I think, pretty proficient, more so than probably other academics I've met, especially after yesterday for me. So like it's a
Sure.
breath of fresh air talking to somebody who actually like can talk and have a two-way conversation. It's super nice, and like Twitch has enabled me to meet a lot of people like that. Because I think we kind of self-select in a way for our presence on the platforms because we have that proficiency, right?
Yeah.
We can sit here, we can practice it, and have conversations like this. So for any of my community who's been lurking or participating right now, please give Tofu a follow and tune into their streams, especially for conversations like this, because you might learn something that I can't provide you.
So good.
I have a broad knowledge base, but it certainly does not go as far as outside of biology. So definitely tune into conversations like this to make yourself more well-rounded across all the other disciplines.
And to extent, I was supposed to do this to make sure to follow Homozygoat. It's really easy because it's in the title. I'm sure my mods will give a shout out, but it's actually in the title. I put Homozygoat so you can click in and follow all the socials that you want. But I would like, this is probably a private discussion, but if you don't mind, if you say you have a few friends on Twitch that are science communicators, if you don't mind slipping their names, I will do the harassment myself. But if you could just slip their names so you think they're cool, I'll check them out myself. And I appreciate, and if anyone in chat, guys, your friends who are streamers, big or small, well, preferably not too big because they're just going to ignore me. But I prefer smaller streamers generally that have science and tech backgrounds. I'm happy to start getting in contact. But yeah, other than that, thank you so much, Marcus, for coming on the show. You've been absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, and
Absolutely
thank you for
great.
having me. I always appreciate the opportunity to just nerd out. This has been a great conversation to have back and forth. So very, very thankful for the chance to just come and hang out for a couple of hours.
Thank you. And you had a conference yesterday as well, so absolutely fantastic. So first of all, congratulations on your Twitch partner. I am
Thank
absolutely
you.
jealous, but hopefully one day we'll be with you there. And
Yeah,
then
we'll get you up the ladder. We'll figure it out.
and then the second part of it is I want to say, oh yeah, because you're approaching the end of your PhD as well. I wish you the freaking best of luck. I don't know if you need it, but like, because biology defense and the physics defense might be different. If you need a little bit of tidbits, I could give you some. But I had a really nice defense, so I don't know if it's fair for me to give any advice. But I
No, I
wish you
mean,
the
I
absolute
think when
best
that
of
time
luck.
comes, I might hit you up. I know my committee often forgets they're on my committee in the first place, but
They're assholes,
sometimes
aren't they?
I, I mean, sometimes they can be. They're good people, but they're overworked like everybody else. But yeah, for kind of anticipating and planning for some of the curveballs, I might hit you up because defenses are like that, where your committee more or less is just trying to, ironically, dissect your brain to figure out how you think and how you
Mm,
approach science. So
mm.
yeah, we can have that conversation when I got the actual defense scheduled.
Absolutely,
There's a lot of
absolutely.
work to do before then, but I'll take the luck because sometimes biology needs luck and things to just go right outside of your control. So very much appreciated. Thank you for the well wishes.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to jump into the starting screen and I'll raid over to someone else. But thank you everyone for following. I'm so sorry I turned off a little sound alerts because this video is hopefully going to be a podcast as well. So I'll upload it hopefully soon as a podcast format. But yeah, again, farewell. Good night. Sleep tight. Goodbye.